Tommy was a 12-year-old boy with a peculiar hobby. In the quiet town of Willow's Peak, where children often played in the green fields that surrounded their homes, Tommy preferred to sit alone in the dimly lit attic of his old Victorian house. The dusty room was a treasure trove of forgotten toys, yellowed newspaper clippings, and a peculiar collection of books that his mother had deemed too mature for his age. His eyes, however, were always drawn to the small, leather-bound book, titled The Cryptid Compendium. The book was a grim collection of folklore and myth, filled with tales of creatures that lurked in the shadows of the human imagination. Tommy had discovered it hidden behind a loose brick in the attic fireplace, a relic from a time when the house had belonged to someone with a taste for the macabre. Each page held a new horror, but there was one story that haunted him more than the others: the legend of the Child Eater, a creature that was said to roam the town at night, seeking out the disobedient and the unwary. As he sat cross-legged on the cold wooden floor, the shadows from the flickering candle danced on the walls, casting eerie shapes that mirrored the creatures from his book. The town outside was still, almost holding its breath in the thick silence that preceded a storm. Tommy's heart raced as he reached the final page, detailing the creature's grisly modus operandi. It was said that the Child Eater would knock 3 times before entering a house, and if the door was opened, it would leave with its grim prize. The silence was abruptly shattered by a soft tapping on the window. Tommy froze, his eyes widening in terror as he stared at the darkened glass. The candle flame wavered in the sudden gust of cold air that seeped through the cracks. His mind raced with the horrors he had just read about, and the house around him suddenly felt alive with malevolent intent. He knew he had to find a way to protect himself, to keep the Child Eater at bay. But as the tapping grew louder, he realized that perhaps the creature had already found him. With trembling hands, Tommy grabbed a heavy chair and placed it under the doorknob, hoping it would buy him some time. His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythm echoing through the room like a drum announcing his imminent doom. He heard the creature's heavy breathing, its rancid stench wafting through the floorboards as it approached. The tension grew palpable as he waited, the candle casting a flickering glow over his ashen face. 3 thuds reverberated through the house, each one more insistent than the last. Tommy's breath hitched in his throat. It was the signal he had been dreading, the prelude to his grisly fate. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the creature away with all his might. Yet the thuds grew closer, each one a promise of the horror that was about to unfold. The floorboards creaked ominously under the weight of the Child Eater's approach. The door handle rattled, the chair straining under the pressure. Tommy's eyes snapped open, and he scoured the room for anything that might serve as a weapon. His gaze fell upon the dusty baseball bat leaning against the wall, a relic from his days of playing catch with his father. Gripping it with white-knuckled determination, he prepared to face the creature. The handle felt slick with his sweat, his palms sticking to the worn leather as he readied himself for the confrontation. He knew he had to be brave, had to fight, or become the next tragic story in the town's grim folklore. The tapping grew to a crescendo, the Child Eater's hunger palpable in the very air around him. The door bulged with the force of the creature's will, the chair inching backward with a sickening scrape. Tommy took a deep, trembling breath, his eyes fixed on the door. He knew the moment the chair gave way would be the moment of truth. The room grew colder, the candle flame flickering erratically as the shadows grew longer and more sinister. With a deafening crack, the chair splintered under the onslaught, the door slamming open. Tommy swung the bat with all his might, the wood connecting with something solid. A shriek of rage and pain pierced the air, and the room was suddenly filled with a blur of movement. The Child Eater's form was indistinct, a monstrous silhouette that seemed to shift and twist in the candlelight. Its eyes, however, were unmistakable, 2 burning orbs of malevolence that bore into his soul. The creature stumbled back, clutching at its side where Tommy had struck. It let out an unearthly growl, the sound of 1,000 dying animals trapped in a single furious howl. Tommy knew this was his chance. He lunged forward, the bat arcing through the air once more. The Child Eater roared, swiping a clawed hand at him. Tommy ducked, the wind from its attack rustling his hair. He brought the bat down again, aiming for the creature's head. This time there was no mistaking the connection. A sickening crunch echoed through the room and the creature's eyes went dim. The house grew still once more, the only sound the ragged breathing of a terrified 12-year-old boy. Tommy stared at the motionless form of the Child Eater, his heart racing. The creature lay sprawled on the floor, one arm twitching spasmodically. Slowly he approached, the candlelight playing over the creature's grotesque features. It was larger than he had ever imagined, with skin that looked like decaying leather stretched over a skeletal frame. The stench of death clung to it like a cloak. He nudged the body with the toe of his sneaker, his heart thumping wildly. It didn't move. The child eater was defeated, but at what cost? Tommy looked around the attic, the shadows now seeming to retreat into the corners, as if in fear of the horror he had just unleashed. The candle flickered, casting long shadows that made the room seem even more foreboding. He took a step back, his eyes never leaving the creature. He knew he had to tell someone, had to make sure the town was safe. But what would they think of him? Would they believe his story, or would they think he was just another troubled child with an overactive imagination? Tommy took a deep breath, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't let fear rule him now. He had to be brave. He had to be the hero Willow's Peak needed. With a trembling hand, he reached for the candle, lifting it high to cast more light on the scene of his victory. The child eater's lifeless eyes stared back at him, the flames reflecting in their glazed depths. Tommy felt a strange mix of triumph and revulsion, the reality of what he had just done sinking in. He had killed a monster, but was he any better than the creature that had once stalked the streets of Willow's Peak? The room grew quiet, the creature's final breaths fading away like whispers in the night. Tommy took a step back, his gaze fixed on the lifeless form. The candlelight painted the attic in stark contrasts of light and shadow, highlighting the details of the child eater's twisted body. The book lay open beside it, pages fluttering slightly as if in silent applause for the grim tale it had inspired. The storm outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his next move. Tommy knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't let anyone find the creature's body here. It would only fuel more fear and suspicion. He had to hide it to make sure the town knew it was safe again. The thought of dragging the heavy corpse through the house was almost too much to bear, but he steeled himself for the task ahead. Gripping the baseball bat tightly, he approached the body, bracing himself for any sign of movement. He grabbed the creature's ankles, the cold flesh sending a shiver down his spine. With a grunt, he began to pull it towards the open attic window, his mind racing with the gravity of his actions. Each step was a battle against his own fear, his legs wobbly with the effort and the weight of his grim burden. The rain had started to fall, the soft patter against the glass a stark reminder of the outside world that knew nothing of his nightmarish ordeal. The window was open just enough for him to squeeze the creature's body through. With one last heave, he pushed it out into the night, watching as it disappeared into the darkness below. The candle's flame flickered in the sudden breeze, casting the room in an eerie glow as he stepped back. The rain grew heavier, a curtain that would wash away any trace of what had occurred. Tommy leaned against the windowsill, panting, his heart racing like a wild animal in his chest. He had done it. The child eater was no more. But as he looked down at the bloody bat in his hand, he wondered if he had truly conquered his fear, or if he had just become a part of the very legend he had hoped to erase. The house creaked around him, the storm's fury seemingly mourning the loss of its monstrous kin. Tommy knew that he could never speak of this night to anyone. The secret of what had transpired in the attic of the old Victorian house would be buried along with the creature. The candle sputtered, the flame threatening to go out. Tommy took a deep breath, the smell of wax and fear thick in the air. He had to clean up the mess, to restore the room to its previous state of innocence. He gathered the shattered pieces of the chair and the remnants of his barricade, his movements mechanical as he worked. When the room was as it had been, he blew out the candle, the darkness enveloping him like a comforting blanket. He descended the creaking stairs, the weight of his secret heavy on his shoulders. The house felt different now, the air thick with unspoken terror. Tommy knew that the night would never be the same for him, that the shadows would always hold a hint of the creature's malicious intent. But he also knew that he had survived, that he had faced the boogeyman of Willow's Peak and won. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, the storm outside reached its crescendo, the wind howling like the child eater's final cry. Tommy paused for a moment, listening, before pushing the thoughts away and heading for his room. The town could sleep soundly now, but for him, the night had left an indelible mark, a horror that would linger in his dreams and whispers for the rest of his life. In the stark light of day, the events of the night seemed almost unreal. Yet the bat, now cleaned of its grisly evidence, stood as a silent sentinel in his room, a macabre trophy of his victory. Tommy tried to go about his day as normal, but every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that danced in the corners of his eyes brought back the memory of the creature's malicious presence. The townsfolk of Willow's Peak remained blissfully unaware of the horror that had visited them. They chatted about the storm's aftermath, the fallen trees and power outages, but there was no mention of the child eater. Tommy kept his secret close, the weight of it a constant reminder of his solitary battle. Yet as the days turned into weeks, and the whispers of the creature faded into the fabric of forgotten nightmares, a strange emptiness grew within him. He had killed a monster, but in doing so had he become one himself. The nights grew longer, the shadows darker, and Tommy found himself drawn back to the attic, to the place where he had faced his fears and emerged a changed boy. He would sit by the open window, the rain tapping a rhythmic lullaby on the glass, and stare into the abyss, wondering if he had truly conquered the darkness or merely become a part of it. The book lay forgotten, its pages yellowed and brittle, a silent witness to the night that had altered the course of his life. The story of the child eater remained a whisper in the town, a fading specter of fear that had once held them all in its icy grip. Tommy grew into a man, the tale of his encounter a distant memory that only surfaced in the quiet moments before sleep. But every time the rain fell, every time the wind whispered through the trees, he felt the echo of that fateful night. He knew he could never tell anyone about the creature, the act of killing something so primal and terrifying buried deep within him. The attic remained untouched, a sanctum of his darkest secret. And as the years passed, so too did the whispers of the child eater. Tommy grew tall and lean, his eyes haunted by the shadows of his past. His mother noticed the change, the way he'd sometimes flinch at a sudden noise or stare into the distance with a look she couldn't quite place. She knew her son was keeping something from her, something that had stolen the light from his eyes. The nights grew colder, the air thick with the promise of winter. Tommy found himself drawn to the window, the rain a soothing balm on his troubled mind. But on this night something was different. The tapping at the window wasn't the rain, it was the same rhythm he'd heard that fateful night. His heart thudded in his chest as he approached the glass, his breath fogging the pain. Outside in the alley he saw a figure huddled against the fence. It was a child no more than 8 years old, shivering in the cold, looking up at him with wide, desperate eyes. With trembling hands he unlocked the window, the cold air rushing in like an icy slap. The child scrambled inside, soaking wet, their teeth chattering. Tommy recognized the look of fear, the same fear he had felt so many years ago. Without a word he handed the child a towel and led them downstairs, his mind racing. The creature was gone, but now there was a living, breathing child in his house, and he wasn't sure if he was more afraid for them or himself. The child looked up at him with wide eyes, and for a moment he saw himself reflected in their innocence. The horror of his past swelled within him, threatening to consume him whole. He had killed a monster to protect his own life, but now he had the power to save another. He couldn't let the darkness claim another soul. Tommy took a deep breath, his decision made. He would protect this child no matter the cost. It was his redemption, his way to ensure that the child eater's legacy didn't live on in the heart of Willow's Peak. The creature had left a void in the town's collective memory, a void filled with whispers of the boy who had faced the monster and lived. And as the years turned to decades, Tommy became a guardian of sorts, watching over the town's children, ensuring they never knew the fear that had once plagued him. He built a life around this silent vigil, a life of solitude and quiet heroism. The attic remained his sanctum, but now it was filled with warmth and hope rather than fear. The rain continued to fall, the candle now a distant memory, replaced by the soft glow of a single bare bulb swinging gently from the attic's ceiling. Tommy stood over the lifeless body of the child eater, the bat still clutched in his hand, the weight of his actions finally settling over him like a thick fog. He had killed, yes, but in doing so he had also saved countless lives. The creature's eyes, now dull and unseeing, held no power over him anymore. With a grim determination, he set about the grisly task of removing the body from the house. It was heavier than he had anticipated, the wet fur and cold flesh sticking to his skin as he dragged it down the stairs. He knew he had to dispose of it, to ensure that the creature's malevolence didn't linger in his home. The storm had intensified, the wind howling like a mournful beast, as if it too knew that something terrible had occurred within the walls of the old Victorian. In the alley behind the house, Tommy heaved the body into a large metal dumpster, the clang of it hitting the bottom echoing through the night. He wiped the rain from his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature's blood had painted a crimson streak down the side of the dumpster, a stark contrast against the wet cobblestone. He stared at his hands, smeared with the creature's essence, and felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had done what needed to be done, but the cost was something he wasn't sure he could ever truly reconcile. The storm began to abate, the rain turning to a gentle patter as the clouds parted, allowing a sliver.